Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ben Thomasis, proud Employment and Training Coalition board member and executive director of Queens Community House, where we provide services to 20,000 people every year, strengthening families and connecting them to their communities, providing needed services. It's my pleasure, great pleasure, to introduce David Jones, the CEO of the Community Service Society, and to welcome back Jeff Mays for our next conversation. Thank you so much.
All right, this feels like I was here so long ago. It's great to sit down with you, kind of to discuss this issue. So, I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about workforce development. CSS is known as a social justice, racial justice sort of institution. Do you think workforce development falls within those categories?
Well, the CSS in the last 10 years has made a major shift. The organization started 175 years ago. It was basically the premier social work agency for many years, and it dealt with a wide range of poverty issues. Over the last decade, we've recognized that the chief way for people out of poverty, which has become almost kind of hard, is work. But it can't be just any work. It has to be well-paid work with benefits and other supports. So I think actually the New York Times just came out with an article saying, yeah, people are getting a lot of jobs, but it's not bringing them out of poverty. And that's why we're suddenly seeing the merger of these issues. And I don't think it's only us. I think across the not-for-profit sector dealing with this, there's a recognition that work is the way to do it. We also have started to emphasize and work with unions that are trying to organize low-wage workers. We think that with an individual, and we did a piece for 32BJ who were trying to organize, the workers who were manning offices and the rest, security guards. And some of the stories, we did a lot of one-on-one discussions with unionized security guards and found that their wages were terrible. If they protested hours, they were terminated. They were told there are hundreds of people waiting for that job you have. So an individual can't stand against these kinds of problems.
Fairness, equity have been big issues of the de Blasio administration. What do you think about their efforts so far at kind of addressing this issue? There have been the promise of 100,000 good-paying jobs. Yeah. There's talk about lifting people out of poverty. I think 100,000 people out of poverty.
I think there are things that they can be proud of, and I think anyone in this room can say they're. Obviously they helped with the Fight for 15. They were very supportive of our efforts and others on paid sick leave. I think they are moving in a progressive way. We always complain. That's when you get to my age, you always complain about something. So, we're worried. The 100,000 person jobs, I think you've written about this, is still a dream. And I think there's also the question of whether the jobs that are being created are actually lifting people out of poverty, actually going to the people who are struggling to get a foothold into work. I mean, in the Bloomberg administration, I was highly critical because I was very excited by the new Cornell Engineering and Science Center, but there was never effort to connect it to middle school students in those communities who could have really exploded in terms of now understanding what STEM and the rest was about.
On the last panel, there was a little talk about that sort of skills gap and workers who are not prepared to move into some of these positions and how to connect people with those jobs. You had a very interesting op-ed today in the Amsterdam News. Yeah. Talking about the segregation in the city schools and relating to the workforce in some ways. New York is the most diverse school district, but also the most segregated in the country. How do you see that playing into the idea of equity in our city?
Well, it's clearly created a political firestorm. You know, I have people who come up to me who haven't seen, how could you say such things? I went to Stuyvesant, and you don't want to change anything. I think what finally got my goat was when I was growing up, I grew up in Crown Heights. The ideal, if you were a really smart person of color, you went to Brooklyn Tech. A little beyond my range. But to hear that 12 years ago, Brooklyn Tech had 31% Black and Latino, and now has less than 10%, at a time when the population in the city is becoming increasingly that of color, was shocking. And what we started to see, and the reason Lazar Treshan, who's head of my youth policy, many of you know, started digging into it after the articles appeared showing Stuyvesant had dropped to ridiculous levels of participation. And as another level, I became concerned that all the African Americans who were interviewed were young women. I didn't see any guys. So there's a real question, do I want to go to a school where its gender issues got involved? But it's also our concern that started many years ago that equal access to resources aren't the same. It would be fine. My cousin was former principal of Prospect Heights High School. I've known boys and girls and been there for many speeches and the rest. And then I go on the website for Stuyvesant and I look at the spanking new laboratory they've got that outstrips most colleges in the country. And then we did a little sort of informal survey, and basically we had, at the time we looked, this was a while ago, we didn't have operating labs in a substantial numbers of schools, which were, you know, essentially the minority, or 90%. So the distribution doesn't stop. If we had even a separate but equal, like, you know, that would be terrible. But we're not even getting that. We're getting a system that essentially denies entry to the very best parts of the system and then systematically removes resources away.
What role can, you know, local neighborhood organizations such as yours play in correcting this issue?
Well, as the mayor, we just were part of the victory at Fair Fares, which the mayor was not happy with me about, and he said to me as we passed a couple of days ago, "You're the nicest son of a bitch I know." That was the comment. I think you're going to have to press, and that's what we've done. I mean, I sued the administration just today, actually. We filed suit on unfair fare evasion arrests and trying to get data, nothing more than data, and not saying it's illegal, but we've seen signs that it's racially biased. I think taking a very strong stand, and which is very difficult for the not-for-profit sector, because many of us receive resources from government. So sort of biting the hand that feeds you has always been a tension. But, you know, I think that's going to have to be finding a space through coalition, through others, of being able to take strong stands that call into question critical issues of what the city is doing. And the segregated school system is clearly sort of a shining example. I started to get into this with Lazar's help, looking at the test prep industry that's grown up around the admissions to specialized high school. $3,000 to get ready for the test. And then as I talked to some of my Asian colleagues, I realized that there's another test prep industry that's developed in the Asian community of $1,500 for the 2 summers before you take the exam. This is such a skewed system to have no way in, basically without extraordinary expenditures. And it's not only a question of blacks and Latinos. There are wastelands of Victorians and everything else in white ethnic communities throughout the city, the same issue of being shut out even though they've excelled. And I think it also was worrisome because there were interviews some years ago with students at Stuyvesant who said, well, these kids are not as bright as I am. This is not good preparation for making it in the United States. And in a city this diverse, it's not gonna serve you well to assume that you're so much brighter than everyone else when you really haven't been in face-to-face competition.
You know, we talked about this in a K through 12 range, but backstage you were also mentioning that you kind of see this even going up through the CUNY system. Can you talk a little bit
Well,
about that?
we had a similar discussion. You know, you may not know now that Baruch has fewer blacks and Latinos than Harvard, Princeton, my own Wesleyan. And this was a product. A lot of this is economically driven. I don't like to demonize what's going on, and that's one of the dangers. You go over the other way. As the cost of private education became so astronomical, suddenly parents had to realistically look. Baruch, for a fraction of the cost, provides just as good an education. I'm using Baruch just as a standard. And suddenly, CUNY was inundated with applications. And instead of doing what other sort of elite schools, which Baruch is, of starting to cull based on not only SAT scores, but grade point average and first in your family ever to attend college, all the other things that elite schools do, they went to SAT only. And in doing that, they saved a lot of money, and you don't have to think about it. But in doing that, they started to get a much less diverse student body. And that's a problem. And essentially, when I brought that up to the past head of CUNY, I met a stone wall. They didn't want to change it because of the US news reports that because they became rarefied on the SAT, though USDA is also changing its rankings. They went up into the higher rankings, but they tried to convert what we were talking about as a return to open admission. In fact, the best case in the country is University of Texas, which had a similar problem, but it wasn't because of Black and Latino students. It was because no rural salutatorian or whatever it is could get into the University of Texas. They came up with a rule that the top tier of every high school in Texas would have admission granted to them if they met certain minimal requirements of grade point average and SAT scores. And that transformed it. It helped Black and Latino students, but basically it was a reaction that there were just too many students across the state who had done very well, who achieved, couldn't get into their own university.
In our last few minutes, let's just shift gears a little bit. A lot of previous panels, we've heard about issue of gentrification, shifting, changing neighborhoods. You look at out in Sunset Park, and even with all the work that's going on at the Navy Yards, people still are afraid that, hey, is this for me? With the inward rezoning recently, people fearful that their neighborhood is going to change and they were going to be forced out. How does workforce development play into some of these issues?
Well, clearly, more advantaged communities have a network of attachment to work and to different things like that. When a neighborhood becomes overconcentrated and with people who are poor, the networks aren't there. That's why we've been the staunch supporter with many of you here of essentially universal summer youth employment, because it opens up for somebody. I remember kids growing up on Dean Street in Crown Heights who literally talked about going into the city as a great adventure. So they never left the 4 or 5 square blocks. That's happening again where you become so isolated from where you might find work and talk to different people or meet different people with different attitudes. Work is one of the great ways to get about this. And having a universal summer youth employment program, but not just to make work, but actually start when kids are relatively young, maybe even junior high school, and as their interests develop, actually have them graduate. So if I used to be on the board of something called Jobs for the Future many years ago, and they had a program called Project Protect, which I was just blown away by, where the hospital labs got together and started to identify young people in junior high school who were interested in science. And if they had a certain grade point average, they got a summer job and an after-school job in a lab. As first just a lab, sort of shadower, then a lab assistant. And then on graduation, they were given an opportunity, even as they went to college or other careers, that they could come back and stay on. And it was a economic excitement because the results were extraordinary. Once a youngster got excited by it, keeping the B average became just, of course I'm going to do that. That's my whole summer job, and that's part of my future and what's exciting me. So that kind of idea, if we could grab the administration as it struggles with these really tough political problems of desegregating a system, of actually providing special resources to the schools where people are most isolated, and getting them into not only summer youth employment, after school, but also having career planning where people would sit down and say, what do you want to be? And here's the track to get there. Really investing in that as we wait for a much more inclusive system to appear.
What do you think of some of the solutions that have been proposed to the sort of issue of our segregated school system? The idea of having students from across different middle schools across the city be admitted based on other factors other than the test. Is that part of the solution?
I think so. I think there's going to have to be, we're part of the mayor's diversity panel, or Lazard does this. He's the one who's substance. But I think those kinds of approaches have some efficacy to them. I think, coming to some kind of negotiated requirement on doing away with a pure one-test system. I'm also agitated. I have my grandchild is 6. But the notion we have a test for 4-year-olds for the enriched kindergarten program, what 4-year-old isn't brilliant? Get off this. It drives me crazy. But the fact that a little test prep industry has developed around that, this becomes just weighting the system in a way of using public dollars, basically, to support a segregated system that, if left unchecked, will get that much worse as the economic pressures continue.
Excellent. I think our time is done. Thanks so much for your intelligent insights. Let's give David a round of applause.
Another round of applause for David Jones and Jeff Mays from the New York Times.